This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. The school stood like a fortress, its stone walls looming over the quiet Florida landscape, surrounded by tall, swaying palm trees that offered little solace from the oppressive heat. The building's grand architecture, a blend of modernist and classical Islamic designs, impressed visitors with its towering minarets and sprawling courtyards. It was a place where tradition met the future, where young minds were molded into models of academic and moral excellence. Despite the idyllic exterior, the air inside the school had always been thick with unspoken tensions, a pressure that no one seemed able or willing to alleviate. Located in the heart of a wealthy district in central Florida, the school had a reputation that stretched far beyond the confines of the state. Parents lined up for the privilege of enrolling their children in the prestigious institution, convinced it was the best place for their offspring to receive both an elite education and an adherence to religious and cultural values. But there was something unsettling about the school, something hidden beneath the polished surface of its immaculate classrooms and perfectly manicured lawns. The staff, mostly Muslim teachers who were both locals and immigrants, formed a tight-knit community. From the outside, they were the epitome of professionalism, revered for their high standards and exemplary conduct. Their faith was unwavering, their commitment to their work absolute. The school had earned its reputation, not only for academic excellence but for its adherence to strict moral codes. However, beneath the rigid structure of rules and discipline, something darker was quietly festering. Among the teachers, 5 stood out for their almost unnatural commitment to their roles. Their authority was unchallenged. They were known for their meticulous attention to detail, their iron fists when it came to discipline, and their ability to strike fear into the hearts of the students. There was a coldness in their eyes that many students had noticed but failed to fully understand. It wasn't just a look of authority, it was something more, a hint of something more, a hint of something twisted that lurked just beneath the surface. The classrooms, typically full of energy and eager young faces, now seemed colder than they should have been. The hum of fluorescent lights and the soft shuffle of feet across linoleum floors seemed louder than normal, somehow amplified by the oppressive atmosphere. The school had a certain stillness that hung in the air, like a storm waiting to break. The students whispered among themselves about the teachers, trying to make sense of their increasingly erratic behavior. But the whispers never reached the ears of the administration, for the teachers were masters of maintaining their composure. They appeared as paragons of discipline and faith in front of the higher-ups, careful not to let any cracks show in their perfect facades. The students had no reason to suspect that behind those calm, collected faces lay the seeds of something far more dangerous. To them, the teachers were simply figures of authority, strict but fair. Yet, over the past few months, a subtle shift had occurred. The teachers began to act differently. They stopped making small talk in the teachers' lounge, choosing instead to stay in their rooms, poring over lesson plans that seemed more like scribbled notes in a forgotten language. They spoke less to the students, their smiles growing colder and more rare. They became distant, retreating into their own world, a world the students couldn't penetrate. The school's principal, a kind-hearted woman who had worked in education for decades, noticed the change but was too consumed by her own struggles to confront it. She was tired of the constant pressure from parents, tired of the media attention that the school attracted, and tired of maintaining the illusion of perfection. She trusted her teachers implicitly, believing that their faith and commitment to the school's mission would never waver. She was wrong. Deep down, she sensed the unease, but she pushed it aside, telling herself that it was just stress, nothing more. She couldn't afford to be wrong. The students had grown accustomed to the teachers' increasing oddities. Some even joked about the strange silence that hung over the school, about how it felt like a place where happiness went to die. But the jokes were never quite funny. The sense of dread that clung to the hallways was palpable, like the air before a thunderstorm. And the teachers, those 5 individuals, knew it. They relished it. As the weeks passed, the tension only mounted. The students, most of whom were young adults navigating the throes of adolescence, began to exhibit signs of restlessness. They were tired of the strict rules that governed their every action. The school's policies were draconian: no personal expression, no deviation from the norms, no questioning of authority. But even in the face of this repression, the students began to push back. They challenged the teachers, questioned the lessons, and even defied the strict dress codes. What had once been a symbol of order was beginning to unravel. The teachers, however, saw it differently. To them, the students' defiance was a sign of moral decay, an insidious rot that had begun to infect the very foundation of the school. In their eyes, the students' rebellion was not just a natural part of adolescence, it was an affront to everything they held sacred. The teachers had been patient, waiting for the right moment to act, but the students' growing resistance only hastened their resolve. They believed they were doing God's work, purging the school of the filth they saw in the students' eyes. It wasn't long before they began to make plans. They met in secret, away from prying eyes. The school's security cameras had been tampered with, their feeds disrupted, and the guards on duty were paid off to look the other way. The teachers spoke in hushed tones, their words sharp with conviction. There was no room for hesitation, no room for doubt. Their cause was just. The students had to be stopped. But there was no one to stop them. The administration was blind to what was unfolding behind closed doors. The students, too, were oblivious. Their rebelliousness, their laughter, their chatter in the hallways, none of it signaled the horror that was about to descend upon them. The teachers, cold and calculating, moved with an eerie calm. They had prepared for this moment for months, carefully selecting the day and the time when they would strike. The final day arrived with a foreboding stillness, a quiet that seemed to hang in the air, thick and suffocating. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the grounds of the school. Inside, the students shuffled into their classrooms, none of them suspecting the terror that awaited them. The teachers, however, were ready. They moved through the halls like shadows, their faces expressionless, their hands steady, each step bringing them closer to the moment they had been waiting for. And as the bell rang to signal the start of the school day, it was the last time anyone would hear that sound without the weight of fear attached to it. The school, once a symbol of safety and discipline, would become a place of nightmares. The teachers would make sure of that. The motivations behind the massacre were not simple, nor were they born overnight. They had been simmering, quietly festering for years in the minds of 5 teachers at the prestigious school, until they finally reached a boiling point. Their grievances were complex, shaped by personal histories, ideological convictions, and an escalating sense of betrayal. To understand why these individuals, once pillars of faith and discipline, had succumbed to the horrors they were about to unleash, one had to understand the layers of their pain, their fear, and their twisted sense of purpose. For Ibrahim, the oldest of the 5, the seeds of radicalization had been sown long before he had set foot in the school. He had grown up in a war-torn country, where the sound of gunfire and the smell of burning buildings were part of his daily existence. He had been a young soldier, fighting in a conflict that was both foreign and personal. His faith had been his only refuge amidst the chaos, a solid ground on which to stand as his world crumbled around him. But it was also during these years of conflict that he had lost everything: his wife, his children, his home. In the madness of war, the lines between right and wrong had blurred. Ibrahim had seen horrors that no man should ever witness, and the scars they left on his soul were permanent. After the war, Ibrahim had fled to the United States, seeking solace in the religious community that had long promised peace and stability. For a time it had worked. He found a home at the school, where he was respected by his colleagues and admired by the students. But over time, the memory of his lost family and the pain of what he had endured began to consume him once more. The faces of his children haunted his dreams, and in the quiet moments of reflection, the anger he had tried to suppress began to bubble to the surface. He saw in the students of the school not just young minds seeking education, but symbols of everything he had lost. They were ungrateful, naive, and blind to the struggles of the world. He began to view them as corrupted, morally weak, undeserving of the privileges they enjoyed. Ibrahim's sense of betrayal was profound. He had survived a brutal war, clinging to his faith, only to come to a land where he felt out of place. He saw the students, many of whom came from affluent families, and took their education for granted as a living reminder of everything he could never have. They were the spoiled children of a society that valued materialism over faith, indulgence over discipline, and worst of all, they had no idea of the horrors that awaited them in the real world. Ibrahim believed that by taking action, he could purify them, rid them of their ignorance. In his twisted mind, he wasn't just punishing them for their insolence, he was saving them. Then there was Aisha, who had been born into a family that revered tradition above all else. Her father, a strict patriarch, had always pushed her to excel, to embody the perfect image of what a Muslim woman should be. Aisha had complied. She had studied hard, worked tirelessly, and maintained an outward appearance of perfection. But the pressure had taken its toll. She had married young, as was expected, and her husband, too, was strict in his views. But their marriage had been a trap. Aisha had felt suffocated by the expectations placed upon her, both by her family and by society. Her husband's expectations grew more oppressive over the years, and she found herself growing resentful. She had borne his children, But each pregnancy seemed to chip away at her sense of identity, leaving her feeling invisible, like a vessel for his desires. She had tried to find solace in her work at the school, but even there, she had been forced to play the role of the perfect, obedient teacher. The students admired her, but she felt they didn't truly understand her struggles. They were free to live their lives as they saw fit, while she was trapped in a gilded cage, her every move scrutinized, her every word controlled. Aisha's anger simmered quietly beneath the surface, a constant reminder that her life was not her own. She began to resent the students not only for their freedom but for their disregard of the values she had been raised to uphold. They questioned authority, mocked the traditions she held dear, and lived lives that seemed antithetical to everything she had been taught to believe in. The more she saw this, the more she despised them. They were the embodiment of everything that had trapped her, everything that had caused her suffering. Aisha saw herself as a martyr, someone who had sacrificed her own happiness for the sake of duty. And now, in her eyes, the students needed to pay for their irresponsibility, their rebellion against the very traditions that had kept her, and by extension, the world together. Yusuf, the youngest of the five, had always been different. He had come from a family of intellectuals, men and women who prided themselves on their open-mindedness and progressive values. His parents had been well-respected figures in the community, and they had raised him to believe that education was the key to solving the world's problems. But as he grew older, Yusuf began to feel a deep disconnect between the ideals his family had instilled in him and the world he saw around him. He had been taught that knowledge was power, but he realized that for many of the students at the school, knowledge was nothing more than a means to an end. They didn't seek wisdom, they sought status. They weren't interested in understanding the complexities of the world, they wanted to conform to a mold that was easy, comfortable, and shallow. Yusuf had become disillusioned with the world he had once admired. He had watched the students, those who had been given so much, squander their potential in favor of superficial pursuits. They didn't understand the power of knowledge because they didn't care about it. He had tried to push them, to inspire them, but they had rejected him. He saw their apathy as a form of corruption, and it made him sick. But what broke Yusuf was something far deeper. His own family had rejected him when he tried to challenge their progressive views, accusing him of being too rigid, too extreme in his beliefs. The rejection shattered him. He had been searching for meaning, for a purpose that extended beyond the mundane, and in his search he had found a version of faith that called for drastic action. In his mind, the students were not only apathetic, they were dangerous. They were the manifestation of everything that had failed in his own life. He believed that the world was at a tipping point, and that it was up to him to restore balance by force, if necessary. Then there was Nabil, a teacher of philosophy and religious studies, whose grief was rooted in loss, not just personal but spiritual. Nabil had been a different man when he first arrived at the school. He had been kind, open-hearted, and patient. But after a series of personal tragedies, he had lost his wife to a sudden illness, then watched his only son drown in an accident. Nabil's outlook had shifted dramatically. His faith, which had once been a source of strength, had become an empty void. He saw the world as a cruel and unjust place, where suffering was inevitable and punishment was deserved. In his grief, Nabil began to feel an overwhelming urge to cleanse the world, to erase the filth he saw in it. The students, to him, were part of that filth. Each teacher's motivation was twisted, driven by personal pain, radical beliefs, and a desire to purge the world of what they saw as its imperfections. They didn't see themselves as killers, they saw themselves as saviors. They believed that their actions would bring purity, that by striking at the heart of the school, they would rid it of the corrupt influence of the students who, in their eyes, had failed to uphold the ideals they cherished. Their grievances were not just about rebellion or disrespect. They were about the deep, festering wounds that had been inflicted upon them by a world that they felt had betrayed them. They saw themselves as the last guardians of a forgotten purity, and in their minds, the massacre was not only justified, it was necessary. It was the only way to restore balance to a world they believed had lost its way. For months, the planning of the attack unfolded in the shadows of the school, hidden from the scrutiny of administrators, parents, and students. There were no meetings in open spaces, no rehearsals for the coming horror. Everything was done in secret, carefully, quietly, with an eerie calmness that betrayed the magnitude of what was about to occur. The teachers, each bound by their own grievances and beliefs, moved like phantoms through the halls, preparing for the day that would burn away the facade of peace and academic excellence the school had long claimed. Ibrahim was the first to set the plan into motion. His long years of service at the school had taught him how to operate undetected. He had observed the security systems, studied the building's layout, and noted the timing of the daily routines. The school's surveillance cameras, a seemingly omnipresent fixture in every hallway, had become an obsession for him. Ibrahim had a gift for understanding systems, and over the weeks he had learned how to disable them with minimal effort. At first it was small, seemingly insignificant malfunctions, a flickering light here, a camera that occasionally went dark for a few seconds there. But no one paid attention, assuming it was just technical glitches. It wasn't until the pattern became apparent that the cameras began to malfunction with a precision that suggested sabotage. Ibrahim wasn't concerned. He knew the school was too reliant on its security infrastructure, too blind to the reality that its watchful eyes could be easily thwarted. And if the cameras failed to capture his movements, it was only a matter of time before the rest of the plan fell into place. Each teacher contributed in their own way, lending their particular skills and insights to the operation. Aisha, meticulous and methodical, focused on the timing. She had spent weeks observing the students' daily rhythms, their arrival times, their movements between classes, and the precise moments when the school buzzed with activity. She knew when the halls would be at their busiest, when the students would be most vulnerable. She also knew when the teacher's lounge would be empty, when the school's corridors would fall silent. It was during these moments that she would act, but only after everything was in place. Yusuf, eager to prove himself, focused on the logistics. He was the one who quietly researched firearms and explosives, learning about the most efficient ways to strike fear into the hearts of those who stood in his way. His fascination with destruction was not born out of rage alone, but out of a growing need to control and dominate. It wasn't enough to simply kill. He needed to make an impact, to send a message that would resonate long after the blood had dried. Yusuf scoured the internet for the most efficient, undetectable weapons, finding suppliers who were willing to operate in the shadows. With careful calculation, he began acquiring what would soon become the tools of their devastation: small arms, explosives, and even fire accelerants, all stored carefully in his locker, hidden from the prying eyes of his colleagues. Nabil, always the quiet observer, began his preparations in a more subtle way. He wasn't interested in the immediate violence. His focus was on the psychological element. He had spent years teaching students about the nature of suffering, punishment, and moral clarity, and he understood the power of fear. His contributions to the plan were small but significant. He began spreading subtle messages through his lessons, embedding ideas into his students' minds that reinforced the need for cleansing the world. His lectures became more pointed, more philosophical, as though he was preparing them for something they could not yet understand. His eyes, once kind and filled with empathy, had hardened, growing colder and sharper with each passing day. He also began subtly reaching out to his fellow teachers, as if seeking validation for his thoughts, but his true purpose was far more sinister. He carefully observed their responses, noting how they reacted to certain ideas. The teachers, unknowingly, began to feed into his worldview. The foundation for the attack was built on a delicate web of shared ideas and ideology that, to them, felt righteous and necessary. By the time Nabil's influence had spread, the teachers were ready to move as one, without question. The school, as a microcosm of society, had unwittingly provided the perfect environment for this twisted collaboration. The students, isolated in their own worlds of rebellion and apathy, had failed to notice the growing darkness around them. They were too distracted by their own personal dramas, too consumed by their rebellion against authority, to see the growing storm. The teachers, however, could feel it, could sense that the moment of reckoning was approaching. As the weeks passed, the teachers grew increasingly insular. The staff room, once a place of casual conversation, had become a place of quiet plotting. Ibrahim no longer participated in discussions about teaching methods or student achievements. Instead, he retreated into himself, spending hours in his classroom, making sure everything was in order for the coming day. Aisha spent her nights meticulously writing out the schedule, timing each move with precision. Yusuf prepared the weapons in secret, ensuring they were ready for the moment they would be needed. Nabil, always the philosopher, kept to his routines, but his eyes were sharp, watching for any signs that the plan was being noticed. The plan itself was deceptively simple in its execution. The teachers would strike when the students were most vulnerable during a regular class day, when the school was full of energy, when the students were least expecting it. They would block off exits, disable the security systems completely, and seal the doors to prevent any escape. Once the chaos began, there would be no way to stop it. It would be swift, brutal, and over before anyone could fully comprehend the scale of what was happening. The day before the attack, the atmosphere in the school was thick with unease. There was an odd silence that permeated every classroom, every hallway. The students felt it but couldn't explain it. There were no overt signs of anything wrong, no explicit warnings. But the teachers, those who had planned this atrocity, were calm, almost serene. They moved through the halls with an unsettling grace, their eyes distant, as if they were already living in a world where the massacre had already taken place. The teachers were not nervous. They had already crossed the point of no return. Each of them had buried their doubts deep within, concealed under layers of justification and twisted reasoning. Ibrahim, the one who had initiated it all, walked through the halls with a look of grim satisfaction, as though everything had already been set in motion. He could already hear the screams, see the blood spilling on the floors, feel the power that would surge through him once he finally struck. The final details were hashed out in hushed meetings held in empty classrooms late at night. The security system was taken offline for the day, Yusuf making sure that it was tampered with just enough to make it useless. Ibrahim positioned himself strategically to be one of the first to strike, knowing the school's layout better than anyone. Aisha would take a position in the hallways, ensuring that the students could not escape. Nabil would be stationed in the teacher's lounge, an unexpected position, but one that would allow him to observe the unfolding chaos and, in his mind, participate in the cleansing of the school. There was a moment, a fleeting, almost imperceptible moment when they all realized that the world as they knew it would no longer exist after tomorrow. But none of them hesitated. The plan had been set into motion, and there was no turning back. The attack would happen, and when it did, it would mark the end of the school's innocence. It would mark the beginning of their reign, the reign that was justified in their minds, a necessary act of vengeance and purity. The last night before the attack was quiet. The teachers slept, if they slept at all, with their eyes closed, but their minds wide awake. They could hear the whispers in the halls, feel the weight of their impending actions. In the dark, they knew that tomorrow would change everything. And in their twisted vision, it would be the world that would finally be cleansed. The morning of the massacre began like any other. The sun rose over Florida, casting its warm, golden light across the sprawling campus of the prestigious school, a place that had long been associated with academic excellence and unyielding discipline. The students filed in through the gates, some laughing, others with their heads buried in their phones, none aware that the world they knew would soon be shattered. The bell rang, signaling the start of another day, and life on campus hummed with its usual rhythm. But beneath this calm facade, a dark and terrible plan was already unfolding, and the world would soon be plunged into a nightmare that none could have imagined. The teachers, however, were not like the students. They moved with a cold, deliberate sense of purpose, each of them aware that this day would mark the end of something, of everything. Ibrahim arrived at the school early, as he always did, long before the first bell. His eyes were hollow, fixed with a sense of grim determination. He walked through the halls as if they were his domain, each step echoing like a drumbeat of an inevitable fate. He checked the security system one final time, ensuring that the cameras were still offline and that the lockdown protocol was in place. The system had been expertly tampered with the night before, and now there would be no outside interference. The other teachers were already in place. Aisha, who had arrived quietly through a back entrance, had been checking the hallway doors, making sure they were locked from the inside. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her face remained unreadable, a mask of cold composure. She walked the halls with precision, ensuring that the students would have nowhere to run when the time came. Each door, each window, each hallway was meticulously planned to trap them, to make them feel like prey waiting to be hunted. Yusuf, his nerves a tight coil of energy, was already in his classroom, sitting at his desk as though nothing were out of the ordinary. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the position of the hidden firearms beneath his desk. He had already mentally mapped out the path he would take once the plan was in motion. It would be swift, it would be brutal, and it would send a message that would reverberate far beyond the walls of the school. He didn't care if anyone lived to tell the tale. He cared only about the power, the control, the dominance that he would soon wield. Nabil, as usual, was the quietest of them all, sitting in his classroom, preparing for the day's lessons. But his eyes were not on the students. They were on the clock, counting down the moments. In his mind, this was the final chapter in a story he had been writing for years. The students had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world. They had become an ideology that needed to be wiped out, cleansed from the earth like a disease. His mind was clear, his heart cold. He had long ago resigned himself to the idea that today was not about personal loss, it was about a greater divine purpose. The chaos that would soon unfold was the ultimate form of justice. By the time the first students began to enter the school, there was no turning back. The doors had been locked from the inside. The hallways had been cut off. The surveillance system, which had once provided a false sense of security, was now nothing more than a useless relic. The faculty and staff, who had once been trusted with the responsibility of nurturing young minds, were now the architects of destruction. The plan was in motion, and it was only a matter of time before the first wave of horror swept through the school. The clock struck 9 a.m. The bell rang once more, and for a brief moment the school seemed as if it were frozen in time. Then, as if on cue, the lights went out. The students, initially confused, looked around in alarm. Some assumed it was just a power failure, but a few sensed that something was off. There was a stillness in the air, a strange weight to the silence that followed. Before anyone could react, Ibrahim's voice crackled over the PA system, but it was not the calm, reassuring tone they had grown accustomed to. His voice was cold, commanding, devoid of any humanity. "Attention all students and faculty," he said, each word deliberate, chilling. "This is not a drill. You will not escape. Your time has come." Panic spread like wildfire. Some students screamed. Others froze, unsure of what was happening. But it didn't matter. The teachers had already taken their positions. Aisha moved through the hallways, blocking any attempt to flee, her eyes burning with something dark, something vengeful. Her presence was like a predator closing in on its prey, calm, precise, and absolutely unyielding. Yusuf was the first to strike, his gun raised as he moved swiftly through the school. He caught a group of students as they tried to run for the exit. The sound of the gunshot rang out, a deafening crack that shattered the silence. A student fell, clutching his chest, his scream cutting through the air. The others scattered in terror, but it was no use. Yusuf moved like a shadow, picking them off one by one, his eyes filled with something wild, something feral. This was his moment, and nothing could stop him. Meanwhile, Nabil stood at the heart of the school, watching it all unfold. He had positioned himself strategically, knowing that the chaos would soon become a tidal wave, one that no one would be able to survive. He could hear the screams from all around him, the sound of gunshots and the thundering footsteps of fleeing students. He could feel the pulse of the school, the frantic energy that was pulsing through every inch of the building. But Nabil remained calm, detached. He had already taken his place in the destruction, his contribution to the cleansing. As the students fell one by one, he observed with an almost clinical detachment. They were like animals trapped in a cage, unaware of the final trap they had walked into. It didn't matter how many died. To Nabil, it was all part of the process, part of the divine plan. He wasn't just executing a massacre, he was fulfilling a prophecy. The halls of the school were filled with chaos. The students, once full of life and energy, were now running for their lives, their faces twisted in fear, their eyes wide with disbelief. The teachers, however, moved with unholy precision. They didn't have to chase the students, they simply blocked them at every turn, corralling them into dead ends, into corners, into rooms where there was no escape. The classrooms had been turned into traps, and the doors, once portals of knowledge, had become sealed tombs. As the minutes passed, the body count began to rise. The students who had once walked through the school with their heads held high, laughing with their friends, texting on their phones, were now falling to the ground in a heap of blood and broken bodies. The halls that had been filled with laughter and chatter were now filled with the echoes of death. The walls, once pristine, were now stained with the remnants of what had once been innocent lives. The lights flickered back on briefly, illuminating the carnage in all its horrifying detail. The students' cries echoed through the corridors, but it was too late. They were trapped, and the teachers were closing in, one by one. There was nowhere to run. The doors were sealed, the exits blocked. The school had become a death trap, a hunting ground where the prey had no chance of survival. In the final moments, as the air grew thick with the stench of fear and blood, Ibrahim's voice came over the PA again, this time with a finality that sent a chill down everyone's spine. "This is your reckoning," he said, his voice resonating through the school like a death knell. "You have failed. We are the chosen ones. You will remember this day, for it is the last one you will ever know." And with that, the massacre continued. The teachers, relentless in their pursuit, became the executioners of a fate that had been sealed long before this day. The students, their lives snuffed out like candles in the wind, had no chance to understand the true horror that had been unleashed upon them. The school, once a place of learning, had become a tomb, and in the silence that followed the bloodshed, it would forever carry the weight of its destruction. When the bloodshed finally came to an end, the school was left in a state of utter devastation. The once vibrant hallways, filled with the chatter of students and the shuffling of feet, had become silent, save for the faint hum of emergency alarms and the occasional scuffling of movement from those still alive. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, sweat, and blood, and the sound of distant sirens grew louder, a reminder that the world outside was still moving, still functioning, while inside the school, the nightmare unfolded. The bodies lay scattered across the floor like discarded dolls, twisted in unnatural positions, blood pooling beneath them in dark, gruesome lakes. The once pristine white walls were now streaked with red, a macabre reminder of what had taken place. Desks were overturned, chairs thrown across the room, and windows shattered, some with students trying to escape in vain before being cut down by the relentless barrage. The windows that had once framed the bright Floridian sky were now portals to a world they would never see again. The few who remained alive were scattered throughout the building, trembling in the corners of classrooms under desks or in the most hidden, isolated spaces they could find. The air was heavy with fear, thick with the understanding that the school was no longer a place of safety, but a killing ground. The survivors, their faces pale and wide-eyed, clung to the hope that someone, anyone, would come to end the madness. But they knew, deep down, that their world had changed irreparably. There was no coming back from what had happened. In the aftermath, time seemed to stretch on unnaturally. The minutes crawled by like hours, and every creak of a floorboard, every distant scream, felt like a reminder of the horror that had unfolded. The survivors, too terrified to move, could only listen as the sounds of the chaos continued to echo through the school. The cries for help, the desperate attempts to escape, the pounding of footsteps on the hallways, each sound, each fleeting moment, was a reminder that they had narrowly escaped death. But it wasn't just the sounds that haunted them, it was the silence. The silence between the screams. The silence after the gunshots. The deafening, suffocating quiet that followed the execution of the plan. Outside, the world was beginning to realize the magnitude of what had occurred. News outlets were already reporting on the tragedy, though the full scope was still unclear. The school's phone lines, once a lifeline for administrators and staff, were silent. Emergency responders, law enforcement, and ambulances were still on their way, but they hadn't yet arrived. Those on the outside, still struggling to process the initial reports, had no idea what awaited them within the walls of the school. What awaited them was not just the destruction of young lives, but the collapse of an institution that had once been seen as a beacon of safety. The first responders who arrived were unprepared for what they found. As they entered the building, their footsteps echoed through the darkened hallways, and the images they encountered were like something out of a nightmare. The bodies of students and faculty were scattered, their eyes wide open in terror, their hands reaching out in futile attempts to escape. Some of them still clutched at the walls or door frames, their last desperate efforts to find safety frozen in time. The responders were numb, too shocked by the carnage to fully comprehend the scale of the tragedy. Every corner, every hallway revealed new horrors. There were no survivors to explain what had happened, only the aftermath, a gruesome tableau that spoke of unspeakable violence. Outside, the streets surrounding the school were filled with flashing lights, the sound of police sirens wailing in the distance. News vans crowded along the sidewalks, reporters scrambling to gather information. The police had cordoned off the area, pushing back anyone who tried to approach, including parents, whose frantic cries for their children filled the air. The horror outside matched the chaos within, as the people who loved and cared for the students tried to make sense of a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. There was no clear explanation for what had happened. No warning signs, no clear motive. It was as if the very foundation of trust had been shattered, and the fragile illusion that the school was a safe place had been exposed as a lie. The public was left to grapple with the terrifying realization that it wasn't just a random act of violence, but a meticulously planned and executed massacre, carried out by those who had once been trusted to protect and teach. The shock was overwhelming, the grief suffocating. The survivors, once they were found and evacuated, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Some of them were too young to fully understand what had happened, but the trauma would follow them forever, staining their memories in ways that no amount of time could ever erase. Others, older and more aware of the world, would struggle with the guilt, the confusion, the overwhelming horror of knowing that they had narrowly escaped death while so many others had not. In the days and weeks that followed, the survivors would be forced to relive the horrors over and over again in therapy sessions, in interviews, in media reports, unable to escape the nightmarish images of that fateful day. But it wasn't just the survivors who were affected. The entire community was shaken to its core. Parents, teachers, law enforcement, and local officials all struggled to come to terms with the reality of what had happened. No one was immune from the horror. The school, once a symbol of education and opportunity, had become a symbol of destruction. The campus would forever be haunted by the ghosts of those who had died there, the bloodstains on the floor a permanent reminder of the violence that had transpired within those walls. In the aftermath, rumors began to swirl about the motives behind the attack, but answers were few and far between. The police, overwhelmed by the scope of the tragedy, were still piecing together the events that had led up to the massacre. The teachers who had carried out the attack had been killed, either in the chaos of the aftermath or in a final act of self-destruction, leaving only questions in their wake. Why had they done it? What had driven them to such extreme measures? There were no clear answers, only whispers and conjecture. But one thing was certain: the school would never be the same. The tragedy that had unfolded on that day would echo through the halls forever, leaving behind a scar on the community, on the survivors, and on the nation as a whole. The panic, the chaos, the grief, these would be the lasting legacy of that terrible day. And no one would ever forget the blood-stained walls, the cries of the innocent, and the horror of what had once been a place of learning, now reduced to a graveyard of broken dreams. The investigation into the massacre at the prestigious Florida school began immediately after the first responders had secured the scene. The building, once a symbol of safety and achievement, had been reduced to a crime scene, its halls thick with blood and the haunting stench of death. Detectives and forensic experts flooded the campus, their every step a stark contrast to the silence that now enveloped the school. The questions started immediately, but answers were slow to emerge, leaving only a chilling sense of confusion that gnawed at those who were trying to make sense of the horror. At first, the authorities were baffled. There were no clear signs of forced entry, no initial indications that the attack was the result of a political or terrorist plot. The teachers responsible for the massacre were all found dead, their bodies scattered among the carnage, each of them having apparently taken their own lives in the final moments. The lack of survivors among the perpetrators only deepened the mystery. Why had they done it? What had driven them to turn on the very students they were meant to protect? The forensic teams combed through the teachers' personal effects, searching for any clue that could shed light on their motivations. Letters, diaries, and digital records were painstakingly reviewed. As the days passed, small pieces of the puzzle began to surface. Aisha's journal revealed her growing disillusionment with the world around her. Her notes were filled with references to a perceived moral decay in society, a world she saw as corrupt and sinful. She had written of her desire to cleanse the world of what she viewed as its impurities, to restore a kind of twisted order. Ibrahim's personal emails painted a darker picture still. His messages were filled with a mix of paranoia and rage. He spoke frequently of a great reckoning, a time when the world would pay for its wrongdoings. He mentioned feeling rejected by the system, abandoned by those he had trusted, and believed that the only way to restore balance was through violence. His notes contained ramblings about purifying the minds of the youth, ridding them of the corrupting influence he believed they had absorbed from society. Yusuf, the most calculating of them all, had left behind no personal diary, but his phone records told their own story. He had visited extremist forums, interacted with radical groups online, and expressed disdain for the educational system, which he felt had failed to instill the values he held dear. His actions were cold, methodical, as if he had been preparing for this day for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. The final piece of the puzzle came from a shared document on a hidden cloud drive. Nabil, always the quiet one, had uploaded a manifesto. His words were carefully chosen, each sentence dripping with contempt for the very idea of education, which he saw as a breeding ground for hypocrisy and corruption. He had written at length about his belief that the world was being shaped by false ideologies, and that it was his duty to bring about a new order, one where purity and conviction were revered above all else. Piecing these fragmented clues together, the investigators began to understand the sickening depth of the teachers' shared motivations. It was not just a matter of individual grievances, but a collective worldview, a belief that the world had to be destroyed before it could be reborn. A belief that in their twisted vision they were executing some kind of divine retribution. The massacre was not an isolated act of violence, but the culmination of years of resentment, radicalization, and an all-consuming need for control. As the investigation unfolded, the chilling realization set in. The teachers had been planning this massacre for far longer than anyone had realized. They had each been playing their part, weaving together a network of grievances, personal failings, and ideological convictions into an unholy tapestry. The horror wasn't just in what they had done, it was in the cold, calculated way they had gone about it, the sheer intensity of the darkness that had consumed them all. The motive was clear now, but no less terrifying. They believed that they had been chosen to carry out a mission of cleansing, a mission that had ended in a blood-soaked school, a graveyard of youthful potential. And in the end, the truth only added to the nightmare.